Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast, available every morning on Apple, Spotify or wherever you listen. It's Wednesday, the 3rd of April in London. I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up today, Taiwan is hit by the strongest earthquake in a quarter of a century, levelling buildings and disrupting the world's biggest chip maker. Rishi Sunak says he's appalled by the deaths of 3 British aid workers in Gaza as Joe Biden also escalates his criticism of Israel. And going for a trio, Fed speakers weigh in on the number of times they expect to cut interest rates this year. Let's start with a roundup of our top stories. Taiwan has been hit by the strongest earthquake in 25 years. The 7.4 magnitude quake struck the east of the island just before 8 a.m. local time. Bloomberg's Adrian Kennedy is in the capital, Taipei.
Taipei right now is back to normal. There are cars and motorcycles on the street. We're operating from our offices here normally. Taiwan people are pretty resilient. They're used to earthquakes. They're used to severe flooding and typhoons. It's a fairly natural disaster-prone island. On the east coast, that is an area which is more remote. It's cut off from much of the island by mountains. We do have reports of some houses having collapsed. We do have some reports that rescues are being underway for people who may be trapped in those houses.
Bloomberg's Adrian Kennedy also adding that the world's largest chip maker, TSMC, is still assessing the impact of the quake. Taiwan accounts for more than half of the global market for laptops, motherboards and routers. Tsunami warnings were issued in parts of Japan and China, but later downgraded. Rishi Sunak has told the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that he's appalled by the deaths of 7 aid workers in central Gaza, including 3 British citizens. Sunak joins several other Western leaders who've condemned the airstrike, including US President Joe Biden, who issued his strongest criticism of Israel yet. Bloomberg's Ed Baxter has the story.
President Biden says Israel has not done enough to protect civilians in Gaza. This following the killing of 7 World Central Kitchen workers providing aid to Palestinians. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says the work they're doing there is extraordinary.
We've spoken directly to the Israeli government about this particular incident. We've urged a swift, a thorough, and impartial investigation to understand exactly what happened.
And the president is now also pushing for an immediate ceasefire as part of a hostage deal. Ed Baxter, Bloomberg Radio.
The US President also spoke with Chinese leader Xi Jinping, their first one-to-one conversation since last November. Biden discussed concerns about China's trade policies and support of Russia. China analyst Anna Ashton says the US administration has actually managed to get China to engage positively.
Beijing was avoiding senior-level military-to-military engagement, but we've seen multiple meetings since last November that have made progress on that. There's upcoming efforts to have a bilateral dialogue on AI risk mitigation. It's refreshing to see that both sides have found something like that is pressing and potentially significantly disruptive to countries everywhere that they want to work on despite their distrust of each other on so many fronts.
The founder of Ashton Analytics also predicted China wouldn't intervene on plans to ban TikTok. For his part, President Xi said that Beijing seeks stable US ties but won't tolerate Taiwanese independence. 2 Federal Reserve officials say it's reasonable to expect 3 interest rate cuts this year. Cleveland Fed President Loretta Mester sees 3 cuts as appropriate, but admits the decision will be a close call. Her comments were echoed by San Francisco's Mary Daly, who predicts trimming rates 3 times but can't guarantee it.
3 rate cuts is a projection, and a projection is not a promise. And I think that's really important because a projection is saying, here's how the economy is expected to evolve, and here's how policy evolve should that occur. We have to be ready for what if inflation's stickier than we projected or I projected. If I look at my projection and I say, well, what if inflation's stickier? We may want to cut less.
San Francisco Fed President Mary Daly speaking there. Both policymakers maintain that the central bank is in no rush to adjust rates at the moment. Loretta Mester added she still wants to see more evidence that inflation is falling before embarking on rate cuts. Tesla has missed its 2024 first quarter sales target by the biggest margin ever, according to Bloomberg data. The car maker delivered just under 387,000 vehicles in the first 3 months of the year. Dan Ives, senior equity analyst at Wedbush Securities, says Tesla's now at a crossroads.
Now, I think for Tesla, this is a fork in the road period in terms of what they're going to do from price perspective, new models over the next few years, advertising. Competition's increasing, demand softened, not just in China, but globally. This is probably one of the more challenging periods I think that we've seen from Musk and Tesla in the last 4 or 5 years.
Dan Ives speaking to Bloomberg there. The results come after warnings from the firm that its growth rate would be notably lower this year thanks to interest rate hikes making its cars unaffordable. Tesla shares fell by 4.9% in New York, extending their 2024 slide to 33%, the second worst showing in the S&P 500 index. And NATO is proposing a fund worth $100 billion over 5 years for Kyiv as part of a package to be agreed when leaders gather in July. As part of the package, NATO could take over the US-led coordination of weapons deliveries for Ukraine. The alliance's 32 members would all need to approve the package. If agreed, it would mark a paradigm shift for NATO, which has previously only sent non-lethal aid to Ukraine. Well, in a moment, we'll get the latest from Taiwan on the earthquake there. Plus, we'll get analysis of the latest commentary from Fed policymakers. But another story that caught our eye this morning, the next innovation from the maker of ChatGPT, a tool that replicates your voice. It's called Voice Engine, and Bloomberg opinion columnist Parmi Olsen has been writing about it. She points out that OpenAI isn't the first company to launch such a tool, but given how they've leapfrogged rivals in the past with other products in the AI space, she's urging caution against its general release. Access is currently limited. Now, the company says that it will decide on whether to deploy Voice Engine at scale once it's conducted more tests and assess the result of conversations over how society will adapt. Now, Parmi Olsen says that cloning voices has obvious risks, and OpenAI noting that the risks are high in a big election year, but the company's goal is also to understand the technical frontier and openly share what's becoming possible with AI. Now, the guardrails that the company is proposing, according to Parmi Olsen, don't inspire confidence. The company is suggesting creating a no-go list to block the creation of certain voices that sound too similar to prominent figures. And this is something Parmi Olsen is urging a note of caution in her Bloomberg opinion article this morning as to the extent to which Voice Engine could pose risks in its development as well. So that is the one other piece that caught our eye this morning. You'll see it on Bloomberg.com. Well, let's get the latest now from Taiwan after that earthquake, the strongest in 25 years to hit the island. Dozens of people have been injured. More than 25 buildings have collapsed. Tsunami warnings issued in the immediate aftermath of the quake have now been lifted. Our senior editor, Adrian Kennedy, joins us from Taipei with the latest. Adrian, great to have you on. What can you tell us about the damage that's been caused by this earthquake?
Okay, we continue to suffer from aftershocks to the 7:58 a.m. earthquake, which we hit this morning. But Taipei itself, the capital, where buildings shook strongly, is back to business as usual. The real issue is in the east of the island, in Hualien, which is relatively remote and sort of sheltered from the rest of the island by a large mountain chain. Over there, we have blocked roads, suspended rail services, a number of collapsed buildings. We understand there have been at least 4 fatalities. There are rescue undertakings to seek those people who may be trapped in rubble. But thus far, it appears that while it's the most severe quake since 1999, we won't have anything like the death toll that was seen then when more than 2,400 people died. The president, Tsai Ing-wen, very quickly after the quake struck, mobilized an emergency response center and announced that military assistance would be made available to provincial authorities to assist them with the rescue and cleanup efforts. We do have to wait for more information to come out of Hualien because of its remoteness, and it's possible, or indeed likely, that the death toll and the casualty figure will climb. In the west, however, which is where the main industrial heartland of Taiwan is located, while we did see some fabs, including some from Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing, suspend operations briefly and evacuate some facilities, and while we understand that at least one refinery briefly suspended, we don't appear to have had much damage. We also expect that Taiwan's general accustomedness to typhoons, to regular earthquakes, and to various other threats means that it'll be relatively resilient in terms of production and capacity.
Yeah, we have seen financial markets largely shrugging off the quake for now. The TAIEX index down about 0.4%. How much potential, I suppose, is there to disruption to the semiconductor industry, given that the industry seems to have adapted quite quickly?
I would expect that there will be minimal disruption. I'm not a tech expert, but understanding from what my colleagues who are saying, and also from what's the reporting that's coming out from TSMC, a lot of these evacuations were basically exercises which are immediately undertaken when there's a significant earthquake or tremor. But the underlying facilities, they're built very strongly. The science parks are designed to withstand earthquakes. Taiwan had a very strong earthquake in 2016 in which more than 100 people died, for example. But we haven't seen significant disruption of the tech industry. And indeed, you could argue that the resilience of the island during the pandemic, underscored just how strong the supply chains internally are.
We're going to turn to the latest conversations about the Federal Reserve's rate path now. Rate setters Mary Daly and Loretta Mester both say that 3 interest rate cuts this year are a reasonable baseline. Bloomberg TV anchor Kriti Gupta is with me now to discuss more details. I assume that's Fed policymakers texting you there, Kriti, in the background. Yeah, just getting... Yeah, clearly. Look, how does what we've heard from Mary Daly and Loretta Mester fit into what we've been hearing from other officials in the FOMC?
The divergence between the FOMC is one that is creating even less clarity than we already have from the Federal Reserve and other central banks around the world about just what that time frame around cuts looks like. But the base case between Daly and Mester was the same, actually. The 3 rate cuts are due by the end of the year. Now, if you talk to traders and you talk to kind of economists who hear those comments, you say, when? When is that going to happen? Because if you're already pricing in the first rate cut for sure by the markets, because the markets are always right, obviously, sarcasm intended. The first one comes in July. That doesn't leave you a ton of room before the election to really deliver on those 3 rate cuts. Remember, the Federal Reserve is going to be trying very hard to kind of evade the timing of the election as well, to evade any sort of kind of political ramifications around boosting the economy or boosting the stock market around the time that people hit the polls. So that's going to be front and center. But one of the concerns here is simply that we're now going from evidence of overheating perhaps or normalizing to evidence of that reacceleration. And that's where Mary Daly, I think those comments were really important, where she said, let's give it a second. Let's see what, really reiterating that cautious approach, which is interesting because there's kind of a double-sided take on this. On the one hand, she's dovish in talking about these rate cuts as well. But on the other hand, she's also talking a lot about caution. So it's hard. You can see why I and the entire investment community is confused when you look at some of these rules, because there's a clear consensus among the FOMC members that there's a need to cut, but it's also unclear what they're basing that on.
Yeah, indeed. And look, this is interesting that you say sarcasm about what the markets are expecting, but this is a question of, there was a brief moment last week where we thought the markets and the Fed were on the same page, and now it seems again that we're starting to move in divergent paths, but in the opposite direction to we were before.
Yeah.
I mean, what does that mean for yields?
We got too excited too quickly, apparently.
Us? Never.
Just me then. What it means for yields is you start to see some, wonkiness, for lack of a better term. You see basically a disconnect in the yields, which is what we've been seeing kind of all year long anyway, where you see Fed swaps kind of pricing in this massive moves, but you see the nominal yields not move as much. We've seen that in Fed swaps pricing in 7-6 rate cuts at the beginning of the year, nominal yields being at, say, 410, for example. Not really hitting, I think, crossing 412 was the technical level at that time. Now you're saying, to your point, the exact opposite, where Fed swaps are pricing in fewer rate cuts. We're still looking at 1 to 2, 50% chance in June. That pricing hasn't changed even in the last 24 hours. But you are seeing the idea that nominal yields are now at 431. And you're even hearing the discourse that they might hit 4.5%. Even 5% before they come back down. And that, to your point, illustrates the exact opposite of the dynamic we saw last week.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.